Imagine your wedding night, but instead of privacy and romance, you've got your uncle standing outside your bedroom door cracking jokes, your in-laws inspecting you in the morning, and an entire neighborhood parade complete with torches and obscene songs celebrating your, well, let's just say celebrating things that should probably stay private. Sound like a nightmare? Welcome to ancient Rome, where your wedding night belonged to everyone except you. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of history's most bizarre rituals, a civilization that turned what should be the most intimate moment of your life into a full-blown public spectacle. And we're not stopping there. We're going to meet a teenage queen who became one of medieval England's most feared commanders, explore a civil war so bloody it redefined an entire nation, and uncover how medieval queens wielded power in a world designed to strip it away from them. But before we get into the chaos, if you're enjoying what you're hearing, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this journey, because what we're about to explore makes modern drama look absolutely tame. So get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, and let's travel back to a time when marriage wasn't about love. Privacy was a foreign concept. Queens fought with armies instead of words, and your wedding night required an audience, witnesses, and apparently zero shame whatsoever. Part 1. The Roman Wedding Night. Let me be crystal clear about something right from the start. When we talk about ancient Roman marriage, throw every romantic notion you have straight out the window. This wasn't about soulmates finding each other across a crowded forum. This wasn't about passionate declarations of eternal love. And this definitely wasn't about two people deciding they simply couldn't live without each other. Roman marriage was business. Cold, calculated, legally binding business. Think about it this way. To a Roman family, marriage was essentially the same as signing a corporate merger. You had contracts, you had witnesses, you had terms and conditions, and you had absolutely zero interest in whether the bride and groom actually liked each other. That part was completely irrelevant to the entire process. The Romans had a very specific view of love, and it wasn't positive. In their minds, love made people do stupid things. Love made you impulsive. Love clouded your judgment and caused you to write terrible poetry. Love, in extreme cases, could even start civil wars. And the Romans had already dealt with enough civil wars, thank you very much. They didn't need romance adding to the chaos. So what did Romans trust instead of love? Tradition. Contracts. Legal agreements. Systems that had been working for centuries, and weren't about to change just because someone had feelings. Their ancestors had been arranging marriages this exact same way for generations, and those ancestors were absolutely not accepting any suggestions for improvement. Marriage existed for very practical reasons. It connected families who needed alliances. It secured property and kept wealth moving in the right direction. It produced legitimate heirs, so there wouldn't be messy inheritance disputes later. And it kept those inheritance disputes from escalating into violence or, even worse from a Roman perspective, expensive lawsuits. Where did emotional fulfillment rank on this list of priorities? Somewhere below owning a decent toga and above remembering to sacrifice to the household gods. It was nice if it happened, sure, but nobody was planning for it. If genuine affection developed between a husband and wife over time, that was considered a pleasant bonus. If it didn't develop, well, that's what mistresses and discreet arrangements were for. Very efficient system. Morally questionable by our standards, certainly, but undeniably Roman in its practicality. This transactional approach explains exactly why the wedding night mattered so incredibly much to Roman society. It wasn't about romance or creating a beautiful memory. It was about evidence. Cold, hard, legally significant evidence. The wedding night proved that the bride had officially transferred from her father's household to her husband's household. It proved that the marriage contract had moved from being a theoretical agreement to an undeniable reality. And it proved that any future children wouldn't require awkward explanations about legitimacy. Romans absolutely hated ambiguity. They hated uncertainty. And they especially hated situations where someone could show up years later and claim, well, actually, technically speaking, the marriage was never properly completed, so everything that happened after that is legally questionable. That kind of statement caused absolute chaos. It created inheritance problems. It sparked family feuds. It resulted in extremely long legal arguments involving lawyers who charged by the hour. Well, metaphorically by the hour, because accurate timekeeping was still a complete mess in ancient Rome, but you get the idea. So the wedding night was specifically designed to eliminate any possibility of doubt. It was loud, deliberately and unavoidably loud. It was public in ways that would horrify modern people. And it was witnessed by relatives, neighbors, household gods, and probably at least one uncle who absolutely refused to leave even when everyone else had gotten the hint. Romance didn't enter that room. Tradition did, and tradition sat down without asking permission and made itself extremely comfortable. The bride wasn't marrying for herself or for her own happiness. She was marrying for her family's future security and status. The groom wasn't gaining a romantic partner or a companion. He was gaining responsibility, social expectations, and a mother-in-law who would absolutely be judging his performance as a husband within the first week. To modern audiences watching this or listening to this, the whole system feels cold. It feels uncomfortable. It feels, let's be honest, slightly horrifying. But to Romans, this was stability. This was order. This was how you built a society that could last. A society as obsessed with order as Rome couldn't afford to let emotional spontaneity drive major life decisions. Marriage had to be clear, it had to be unquestionable, and it had to be impossible to undo without facing serious legal and social consequences. Love could show up later if it wanted to. That was fine. But first came duty. And duty in ancient Rome absolutely did not care about your feelings, your preferences, or your comfort level. Now, here's where things get really strange, even by ancient Roman standards. One of the most bizarre rules surrounding a Roman wedding was that the bride was required to act like the entire situation was happening against her will. And I mean required. This wasn't optional. This wasn't a suggestion. This was expected behavior. Even if she genuinely liked the groom, even if she was actually excited about the marriage, even if she'd spent weeks carefully preparing for this moment and looking forward to it, absolutely none of that could show on her face or in her behavior. On the wedding night, enthusiasm from the bride was considered suspicious. It raised eyebrows. It invited gossip. What was considered appropriate and traditional? Resistance. Tears. Dramatic reluctance. Roman society genuinely believed that a respectable bride didn't eagerly leave her family home. Doing so would suggest several deeply problematic things from their perspective. It might suggest impatience, which was unbecoming. It might suggest desire, which was shameful. Or worst of all, it might suggest personal agency, the idea that she had made this choice herself. Instead, the bride was expected to cry convincingly, to protest verbally, and to cling desperately to her mother, as if she were being dragged away by cruel fate itself, rather than being escorted by relatives she'd known and lived with her entire life. This performance wasn't optional or negotiable. A bride who walked too calmly toward her new home risked being judged as shameless. A bride who smiled too enthusiastically invited immediate gossip that would follow her for years. The correct emotional setting for a Roman bride was dramatic reluctance mixed with theatrical despair. Think less like a joyful newlywed starting an exciting new chapter, and more like a tragic heroine being written out of her own childhood against her will. Now here's the thing that makes this even stranger. The guests watching all of this fully understood it was an act. Nobody was actually fooled. Everyone knew exactly what was happening. But everyone played along anyway, because Roman tradition was never really about truth or authenticity. It was about continuity. It was about doing things the way they'd always been done. This ritual reenacted an ancient belief that marriage itself had originated in abduction. According to Roman mythology and cultural memory, the first Roman marriages happened when Romulus and his men literally kidnapped women from neighboring tribes. By pretending to resist, the bride was symbolically honoring that origin story, reassuring everyone about her family's honor, and avoiding uncomfortable whispers later about being too eager. The irony is almost painful when you think about it. The bride's lack of consent was carefully choreographed down to the smallest detail. She was expected to resist, absolutely, but not too much. She should cry, but not hysterically. She should struggle, but never actually escape or make a scene that crossed the line into genuine chaos. Roman weddings were essentially emotional theater, with extremely strict blocking and stage directions. Everyone had a role. Everyone knew their lines, and going off script was socially unacceptable. Meanwhile, the groom stood nearby, pretending not to notice any of this drama, as if he weren't about to take complete responsibility for this entire situation. His job was to look serious, dignified, and slightly burdened. He needed the expression of a man thinking, "Well, this is my life now, and I suppose I'd better accept it." This whole ritual served a very clear purpose in Roman society. It publicly marked the bride's separation from her childhood household. Once she'd been pulled away, with appropriate drama and witnesses, there was no ambiguity left. There was no soft transition period. There were no lingering attachments to her old life. The old life ended dramatically, in front of everyone, so the new one could begin without anyone questioning whether the transition had actually occurred. To modern sensibilities, this feels deeply unsettling. The whole premise makes us uncomfortable because it mimics real situations of coercion and removes genuine consent from the equation. But to Romans, this was actually reassuring. A woman who appeared reluctant was demonstrating that she was respectable. A marriage that looked difficult and required effort was considered more legitimate than one that seemed too easy. In ancient Rome, desire was inherently suspicious. Resistance was respectable. And pretending you didn't want something was often the very first step toward being considered worthy of receiving it. Once the bride had demonstrated sufficient reluctance, once she cried enough and clung to her mother with appropriate drama and performed emotional resistance at an acceptable Roman level, it was finally time for the wedding night to truly begin its next phase. And by begin, ancient Rome meant something that would make modern people immediately uncomfortable. A ritual kidnapping, conducted in front of friends, family, neighbors, and basically anyone else who happened to be nearby and enjoying the spectacle. The bride was physically pulled away from her mother's arms. This wasn't done violently or cruelly, but it was done firmly and with considerable drama. The goal here was pure symbolism, not actual injury or trauma. This moment marked the official severing of her ties to her childhood household. From this specific point forward, she no longer belonged to her father's family in any legal or social sense. She now belonged to her husband's household, to his gods, and to his family's expectations for her behavior and her future. Romance was still absolutely nowhere in sight, by the way. Not even on the horizon. This wasn't a surprise to anyone involved. Everyone knew this moment was coming. The bride knew, the groom knew, every single guest knew exactly what was going to happen. And yet the ritual demanded full commitment from everyone involved. You couldn't half kidnap a bride in Roman society. That would look unserious. That would suggest you weren't fully committed to the tradition. Roman tradition demanded full participation from everyone, preferably with enough noise and drama to ensure that any nearby ancestors were fully aware that a legitimate marriage was taking place. Guests often cheered loudly during this moment. They weren't cheering out of cruelty or because they enjoyed seeing someone distressed. They were cheering because cheering was literally part of the required performance. The louder the crowd, the more legitimate the marriage appeared to observers and to society at large. Silence during this moment would have suggested doubt about the marriage. And doubt was extremely dangerous in Roman society. Doubt led to questions. Questions led to legal challenges. Legal challenges led to inheritance disputes. And Romans absolutely did not want to deal with any of that messiness later on. The bride's apparent distress during this moment served multiple social purposes simultaneously. First, it reassured everyone watching that she hadn't rushed into this marriage out of personal desire or impatience. She was leaving reluctantly, exactly as a respectable woman should. At the same time, it reassured the groom's family that she was being properly transferred to their household, not casually wandering in on her own terms, like some kind of independent person making her own decisions. From a modern perspective, this ritual feels deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Watching someone be symbolically dragged away from their home triggers every protective instinct we have. It looks like something we should intervene in and stop. But to Romans, this was clarity. This was closure. This was a clean break performed loudly and publicly enough that absolutely no one could later pretend it hadn't happened or claim they hadn't witnessed it. Once the bride was removed from her family home, there was no turning back. There were no private second thoughts allowed. There was no quiet reconsideration period. The ritual kidnapping made the transition completely final and irreversible. In ancient Rome, marriage didn't begin with quiet consent whispered in private. It began with a public declaration that childhood was officially over. And nothing declared that ending more clearly than being carried away, while everyone you'd ever known watched it happen. Once the bride had been successfully removed from her family, loudly and publicly, and with all the appropriate symbolic distress, the wedding night shifted into its next theatrical phase. The torchlit procession through the city streets. This was not a gentle, quiet walk. This was not a discreet escort from one house to another. This was a roaming, shouting, fire-filled parade specifically designed to make absolutely certain that everyone within earshot knew that a marriage had just occurred. The procession moved through the streets at night, which added to the drama. It was led by friends and relatives carrying blazing torches. The fire mattered here, and it mattered for several reasons. First, fire scared away evil spirits according to Roman belief. Second, the flames illuminated the bride's transition, making it visible to anyone watching. And third, it added dramatic flair that essentially announced to the entire neighborhood, something irreversible is happening right now, and we brought actual fire to prove how serious this is. Romans loved symbolism, absolutely loved it, but they loved spectacle even more. And this procession gave them both. As the group marched through the streets, guests didn't walk in respectful silence. They shouted jokes. Loud jokes. obscene jokes. Jokes so crude and explicit that Roman writers later, when recording these traditions, actually refused to write down what was being said. And when ancient Romans, who were pretty comfortable with explicit content, refused to record something because it's too crude, that tells you exactly how graphic these jokes must have been. But this wasn't considered poor manners or inappropriate behavior. This was actually protection. Romans genuinely believed that laughter and vulgar language confused jealous spirits, who might otherwise interfere with the marriage's fertility or future success. The logic went something like this. If an evil force or jealous spirit was listening and trying to curse the marriage, the best defense was to overwhelm it with complete nonsense until it just gave up and went away. Honestly, it's kind of a relatable strategy when you think about it. This meant that the bride's wedding night began with her being escorted through the city while her own relatives, people who supposedly loved and cared about her, yelled things that absolutely should not be repeated in any kind of polite company. It was chaotic. It was deeply uncomfortable for the bride. It was mandatory. And privacy was completely, utterly absent. Neighbors leaned out of their windows to watch and listen. Children followed along behind the procession. Random strangers joined the noise just because they happened to be nearby. The louder the procession became, the more legitimate the marriage felt to Roman society. A quiet, subdued wedding night would have suggested that something had gone wrong. That maybe the families weren't fully committed. That perhaps there was some problem with the marriage that people were trying to hide. Romans trusted volume far more than they trusted subtlety. Noise meant certainty. Silence meant potential problems. The groom walked somewhere near the bride during all of this, carefully maintaining a respectable distance and wearing an expression that suggested dignity and responsibility rather than panic. His role was to look solemn and controlled, as if he weren't currently being escorted home by a crowd of people loudly chanting explicit jokes about his upcoming performance as a husband. The procession eventually ended at the groom's house, where the torches cast long, dramatic shadows over the doorway. This moment marked the bride's official arrival into her completely new life. From this point forward, she belonged to this household. She belonged to its traditions. She belonged to its gods. There was no going back to her parents' home except for visits. To modern eyes and ears, this entire scene looks like absolute chaos. It looks disorganized, unnecessarily loud, and borderline cruel to the bride. But to Romans, this was order. This was loud order, firelit order, but order nonetheless. In ancient Rome, marriage was not something you quietly slipped into when no one was paying attention. It was announced. It was shouted from the streets. And it arrived at your door accompanied by flames, laughter, and absolutely zero concern for your nerves or your comfort. By the time the torchlit procession actually reached the groom's house, the Roman guests were just getting warmed up, both literally from carrying those torches and emotionally from all the shouting they'd already been doing. This was absolutely not the moment for quiet reflection. This was not the time for respectful silence or giving the couple some space. This was the perfect moment for obscene wedding songs, delivered at absolutely full volume, with tremendous enthusiasm, remarkable creativity, and zero shame whatsoever. These songs weren't optional background music. They were an expected and completely essential part of the entire wedding night ritual. Romans genuinely believed that loud, vulgar humor protected the couple from bad luck, from jealousy, and from supernatural interference. Evil spirits, according to Roman belief, were apparently quite easily offended and also easily confused. The theory was that if you shouted enough inappropriate jokes and sang enough explicit songs, any malevolent spirits would simply leave out of sheer discomfort. Which, honestly, is pretty relatable if you think about it. The actual content of these songs was deliberately and intensely crude. Guests openly mocked the groom's masculinity. They made incredibly explicit jokes about what the bride and groom's future intimate life would be like. They generally said things that would get you immediately banned from any modern family gathering for the rest of your natural life. But in Rome, this wasn't considered rudeness or inappropriate behavior. This was ritual protection wrapped up in peer pressure and social expectation. Everyone participated because everyone was supposed to participate. The bride, meanwhile, was expected to endure all of this with perfect modesty. She wasn't supposed to laugh out loud. She wasn't supposed to respond to any of it. She certainly wasn't supposed to tell anyone to stop or to please show some respect. A respectable Roman bride absorbed this embarrassment quietly, usually staring at the floor while her own relatives loudly discussed the most intimate details of her wedding night as if it were some kind of public performance that required audience commentary. The groom was in a similarly uncomfortable position. He was being openly mocked, teased mercilessly, and constantly reminded that expectations for his performance were extremely high. These songs served several social functions simultaneously. They reinforced community norms about marriage and sexuality. They publicly acknowledged the sexual aspect of marriage in a way that made it impossible to ignore or pretend it wasn't happening. And they ensured that absolutely everyone understood exactly what this marriage was for from a Roman perspective. Romance, once again, was still nowhere on the schedule. But the audience? The audience was extremely large and getting increasingly loud. Neighbors were definitely listening to all of this. Random people passing by would stop to watch and listen. Children absolutely heard things they probably shouldn't have heard, but would later pretend not to remember when they became adults themselves. Privacy was simply not part of the Roman wedding night experience. It was a communal event with live commentary, audience participation, and absolutely no boundaries about what could or couldn't be said in public. Eventually, after sufficient noise had been made, after enough spirits had presumably been offended into retreating, and after the guests had thoroughly embarrassed both the bride and groom, the group would finally move on to the next stage of the ritual. But these songs mattered tremendously to Roman society. They marked the transition from the public ceremony portion of the wedding to the more private obligation portion. They were the last loud reminder that marriage wasn't just between two individual people. It was between families. It was between ancestors. It was between the couple and society itself. To modern ears, this entire experience sounds absolutely mortifying. The idea of your relatives singing explicit songs about your wedding night, while you stand there forced to listen, sounds like an actual nightmare. But to Romans, this was genuinely reassuring. A wedding night without obscene songs would have felt incomplete. It would have felt dangerous. It would have felt suspiciously quiet, and quiet suggested that something had gone wrong. In ancient Rome, love might have been considered a private emotion. But marriage? Marriage was announced with jokes so loud and so explicit that even the gods couldn't possibly miss hearing them. After all the shouting, after all the singing, and after all the public humiliation disguised as protective tradition, the wedding party finally reached what you might think would be a simple, straightforward moment. Walking through a doorway. To modern people, a doorway is just a functional rectangle you pass through while probably looking at your phone. You don't think about it. You don't worry about it. You certainly don't build elaborate rituals around it. But to the Romans, doorways were absolutely loaded with supernatural significance. A doorway was a liminal space, a threshold between two different worlds. And liminal spaces, according to Roman belief, were incredibly dangerous places filled with bad omens, lurking spirits, and the very real possibility of ruining your entire marriage by simply tripping. Tripping over the threshold was considered absolutely disastrous. It suggested hesitation about the marriage. It suggested misfortune following you into your new life. It suggested divine disapproval of the entire union. In other words, it was the kind of small, easily explainable accident that could apparently haunt you for the rest of your married life, at least according to Roman supernatural logic. And Roman logic really didn't care whether the floor was uneven, whether the bride was exhausted from being dragged through the streets all night, or whether her elaborate outfit made walking difficult. The threshold had to be crossed perfectly, and that was that. So the Romans came up with a beautifully simple solution. Don't let the bride walk across the threshold at all. Problem solved. Instead, the groom lifted the bride and physically carried her over the threshold. This had absolutely nothing to do with romance, by the way. There were no sweeping romantic gestures here. There was no tender symbolism about carrying your beloved into your shared future. This was a purely practical maneuver designed to keep the gods calm, the neighbors satisfied, and the marriage free from supernatural complications. If the bride's feet never actually touched the threshold, then she couldn't possibly offend it or trigger any bad omens. Ingenious, really? This action also quietly reinforced another deeply held Roman belief. The bride didn't enter her new home by her own choice or her own power. She was brought in. She was transferred. She was basically installed into the household like a very important piece of furniture that happened to have opinions and legal rights. The symbolism was incredibly clear and not even remotely subtle. The bride was being delivered to her new household, not choosing to join it independently. The guests watched all of this extremely closely. This was not a moment where you could afford to mess up. Dropping the bride would have been a complete disaster of mythic proportions. People would have talked about it for decades. Slipping or stumbling would have been almost as bad. Someone absolutely would have blamed any future marital problems on that one moment. Oh, they're having arguments. Of course they are. Remember what happened at the doorway. I knew it was a bad sign. Once the groom successfully carried the bride across the threshold without incident, she was officially part of the household. The threshold marked the definitive boundary between her old life and her new one. She crossed it exactly once, while being carried, and that was it. No do-overs. No returns. No refund policies. To modern sensibilities, this feels uncomfortable and controlling. It removes the bride's agency even in the simple act of walking through a door. But to Romans, this was sensible and protective. Doorways were liminal spaces, and liminal spaces were genuinely dangerous from a supernatural perspective. Better to handle them carefully, with witnesses present and torches nearby for protection, than to risk offending fate. In ancient Rome, you didn't casually enter your marriage the same way you might casually enter a room. You were carried into it, carefully and deliberately, because even a single misstep could apparently offend fate itself. And fate, according to the Romans, was known for holding very long grudges. Once the bride had been safely carried over the threshold without tripping, without dropping, and without offending any invisible supernatural forces, attention shifted immediately to the most important piece of furniture in the entire house. The bed. This was not just a bed in the normal sense. This wasn't simply a comfortable place to sleep. This was a ceremonial zone. This was a sacred installation. This was a heavily supervised piece of household infrastructure upon which the entire future of the family line depended. The Roman marriage bed was prepared in advance with almost paranoid levels of care and attention. Flowers were carefully arranged around it. Woolen bands were tied nearby for symbolic protection. Amulets and protective charms were placed discreetly within reach. None of this decoration was done for aesthetic purposes. The Romans weren't trying to make the bedroom look pretty or romantic. They were defending it. They were fortifying it against supernatural threats. Fertility was considered fragile. Prosperity was uncertain. Domestic harmony could be easily disrupted by jealous spirits or bad luck. The bed needed every possible supernatural advantage it could get. The bed itself symbolized continuity of the family line. This was where legitimate heirs were expected to be produced, preferably without complications, without divine displeasure, and without awkward legal disputes emerging years later. Everything about the bed's preparation communicated absolute seriousness. This was not a place for romance or personal connection. From the Roman perspective, this was essentially a workplace with very specific job requirements. The bride was guided toward the bed carefully, often by female relatives, who had strong opinions about everything and were absolutely not shy about sharing those opinions. These experienced women adjusted the bride's clothing, offered detailed instructions, and generally made sure that every single tradition was being followed correctly. The bride didn't simply collapse onto the bed in exhaustion after the long night she'd endured. That would have looked careless and disrespectful to tradition. Instead, she was carefully placed, deliberately positioned, and properly prepared like someone about to participate in an important ritual rather than a private personal moment. Meanwhile, the groom entered the room with whatever level of confidence was expected of a Roman man, regardless of whether that confidence was actually earned or based on any real knowledge or experience. Roman society just assumed he knew what he was doing. This assumption was wildly optimistic at best, but tradition didn't really allow room for hesitation or admitting uncertainty. Hesitation would have suggested uncertainty about the marriage itself. Uncertainty suggested bad omens. Bad omens suggested divine disapproval. So everyone strongly preferred confident ignorance to any kind of cautious doubt. The bed was also public in a way that modern people would find absolutely horrifying. It was discussed openly before the wedding night. It was joked about during the procession. It would be commented on afterward. It was never just between the couple. The bed belonged to the household, to the family line, to the ancestors watching quietly from wherever Romans believed ancestors watched from. It was never truly private property. To modern minds, this idea of a sacred, symbol-heavy, publicly discussed bed feels incredibly intrusive and uncomfortable. It violates every notion we have about privacy and intimate spaces. But to Romans, this was genuinely reassuring. It meant the marriage was anchored in ritual. It meant the marriage was protected by tradition. It meant the marriage was impossible to misunderstand or question later. In ancient Rome, the wedding bed was never about intimacy in the modern sense. It was about legitimacy. It was about producing the next generation. It was about fulfilling social and family obligations. And legitimacy, like absolutely everything else in Roman marriage, apparently required witnesses, protective rituals, and symbolic objects, even when no one was technically supposed to be in the room watching. Once the bride was properly positioned on the sacred bed, surrounded by flowers, wool, protective charms, and the collective anxiety of several generations' worth of family expectations, attention shifted to a very specific and symbolically loaded piece of clothing: her belt. This wasn't just a fashion accessory or a practical item to hold clothing in place. This was a symbolic device absolutely loaded with meaning, superstition, and an alarming amount of pressure for everyone involved. The bride wore a special woolen belt tied in a very particular kind of knot. This knot was associated with strength, with fertility, and with masculine virtue. The knot itself was often specifically linked to Hercules, the legendary hero famous for incredible power, remarkable endurance, and solving most of his problems by applying excessive physical force. Subtle symbolism was clearly not Rome's strong point. They preferred their meanings obvious and impossible to miss. Only the groom was allowed to untie this special knot. No one could help him. No one could offer advice. No one could give him a second chance if he messed it up. This act symbolized his authority as a husband and his new role in continuing the family line. It was less of a romantic gesture and much more of a ritual confirmation that he was now responsible for absolutely everything that would follow. This moment genuinely mattered in Roman culture. Untying the knot incorrectly, doing it awkwardly, or showing visible confusion while attempting it would not have gone unnoticed, even though technically no one was supposed to be watching or present for this moment. Roman culture had a truly remarkable ability to know things it wasn't physically present to witness. Information traveled in mysterious ways. The knot represented restraint, order, and control. Its untying symbolized the official transition from maiden to wife. Once the knot was undone, the marriage moved from being symbolic and theoretical to being real and physical. It moved from public performance to private obligation. And yet, here's the unavoidable irony of the whole situation. The groom was expected to perform this task with complete confidence and natural authority, regardless of whether he had any actual experience or understanding of what was supposed to happen next. Roman society just assumed male competence by default. Reality was expected to somehow catch up later, though how that was supposed to work was never clearly explained. The bride, meanwhile, was expected to remain completely passive and perfectly modest throughout this entire moment. She wasn't supposed to assist in any way. She wasn't supposed to comment or offer guidance. She wasn't supposed to speed up the process. A respectable Roman bride didn't rush anything that tradition had carefully slowed down. Patience and modesty were everything. To modern thinking, this feels painfully awkward. You've got a symbolic knot representing cosmic order and the continuation of civilization, and you're placing it in the hands of two people who barely knew each other, surrounded by a culture that had already discussed their wedding night in graphic detail earlier in the evening. Romance was still absolutely nowhere to be found in any of this. But to Romans, this was perfect clarity. The knot existed to mark a clear boundary, and its untying meant that boundary had been crossed. There was no confusion possible. There was no ambiguity allowed. There was no room for emotional interpretation. In ancient Rome, marriage didn't begin with affection or mutual understanding. It began with a symbolic knot tied by tradition. And once that knot was successfully undone, there was absolutely no pretending that the ritual was still theoretical or that this was just a ceremonial performance. The knot proved that the transition was real, final, and impossible to undo. Now, at this point in the wedding night, you might very reasonably assume that things would finally become private. The door would close. The torches would be extinguished. The relatives would politely go home and mind their own business for once. You would be absolutely, completely wrong. In ancient Rome, the guests did not leave. They didn't go home. They didn't even go very far. Instead, they gathered directly outside the bedroom door like an emotionally invested audience that had paid good money for front row seats and fully intended to get their money's worth from this experience. And they stayed there, listening, commenting, participating. Silence was considered suspicious in Roman culture. Silence suggested that maybe something was wrong. Silence suggested hesitation. And hesitation suggested bad omens that could affect the entire marriage. Bad omens were everyone's problem, not just the couple's problem. So the guests genuinely felt it was their responsibility to stay and make sure everything was proceeding according to tradition and schedule. The guests sang outside the door. They shouted encouragement. They laughed loudly. They knocked on the door periodically. Sometimes they even demanded some kind of noise from inside the room, just to confirm that the marriage was actually proceeding as expected and on schedule. This was not considered rude or inappropriate behavior in Roman society. This was considered supportive. Roman-style support just happened to be loud, intrusive, and absolutely impossible to ignore under any circumstances. The logic behind this utterly bizarre behavior was deeply, genuinely Roman. According to popular Roman belief, evil spirits particularly preferred quiet, intimate spaces where they could cause problems unnoticed by others. A noisy doorway confused these spirits. Loud laughter drove malevolent forces away. Public acknowledgement of what was happening ensured supernatural protection for the couple. If something important was taking place, Romans believed it needed witnesses, even if those witnesses were technically just standing in the hallway making inappropriate jokes. The couple inside the bedroom was simply expected to tolerate all of this without any complaint whatsoever. Asking for privacy would have seriously raised eyebrows. Actually complaining about the noise would have been even worse. Privacy implied secrecy. Secrecy implied that something was wrong with the marriage. And Roman society trusted loud, public validation far more than it trusted quiet discretion. The groom, in particular, was under tremendous pressure during all of this. His relatives, his friends, and his neighbors were all very much aware of what was supposed to happen next, and they were absolutely not shy about commenting on it loudly. The jokes directed at the groom were crude, relentless, and specifically designed to remind him of his responsibilities as a husband. Masculinity in Roman culture was treated as a public performance, even when you were supposedly behind a closed door. The bride, meanwhile, was expected to remain absolutely quiet, perfectly modest, and completely dignified, despite the fact that her wedding night had somehow turned into a spectator sport with live audience commentary. This obvious contradiction didn't bother Romans in the slightest. Tradition rarely concerns itself with comfort, consistency, or making logical sense. Eventually, the noise would begin to fade. Not because the guests felt emotionally satisfied or because they'd grown bored, but because they believed their presence had successfully done its job. The evil spirits had been thoroughly chased away by all the noise. The marriage had been publicly acknowledged by the entire community. The wedding night could now proceed to its conclusion. In ancient Rome, the wedding night was never, ever just between two people. It belonged to the family. It belonged to the household. It belonged to tradition. And it belonged to a crowd of people standing outside the door making absolutely certain that tradition was being properly respected. With the door finally closed for real this time, and the crowd lingering outside just long enough to make completely sure it was actually closed and staying closed, Roman tradition shifted into one of its most revealing contradictions. The bride was expected to be modest, passive, and restrained in every possible way. The groom, meanwhile, was expected to be confident, capable, and completely in control of a situation he had most likely never experienced before in his entire life. This expectation was absolutely not negotiable in Roman society. Roman culture assumed male competence by complete default. Whether the groom was actually prepared, whether he was properly informed, whether he was emotionally ready for any of this, none of that mattered even slightly. He was a Roman man. That fact alone was considered qualification enough for everything that was expected of him. Hesitation was considered dangerous. Uncertainty suggested weakness. And weakness was completely unacceptable, especially on a night that was supposed to symbolize authority, continuity, and social order. The bride, on the other hand, was expected to demonstrate perfect restraint at all times. She didn't lead. She didn't speak openly about what was happening. She didn't express fear, or excitement, or confusion. A respectable Roman bride was quiet, carefully composed, and obediently following whatever was expected of her, even as her entire future shifted dramatically in a single evening. This massive imbalance was not some accidental oversight in Roman culture. It was completely intentional. It reinforced Roman ideas about hierarchy within marriage from the very first moment. The wedding night was not about shared discovery or mutual exploration. It was about roles being established clearly and immediately, with no room for confusion. One person acted, the other received. Ambiguity was treated as the enemy of social order. And then there was the awkward reality that Roman tradition very carefully ignored and never openly discussed. Many brides were extremely young, sometimes very young, and many grooms were not exactly experienced teachers who knew what they were doing. The expectation of effortless competence collided directly with human uncertainty in ways that Roman culture strongly preferred not to acknowledge openly. There were no instruction guides. There were no gentle conversations beforehand. There was no space allowed for mistakes or learning or figuring things out together. Tradition simply assumed that everything would magically work itself out, because tradition always assumed it was correct about everything. Any discomfort that occurred was framed as completely normal. Any confusion was supposed to be endured quietly without complaint. Actually, complaining would have suggested that the ritual itself was somehow flawed, and that idea was completely unthinkable in Roman society. To modern audiences, this entire setup feels deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. The complete lack of communication between the couple, the massive imbalance of expectations placed on each person, the silence that was demanded from one side, while confidence was demanded from the other. All of it highlights just how fundamentally different Roman values were from our modern understanding of marriage and relationships. But to Romans, this was stability. This was order. Clear roles meant fewer disputes later on. Fewer disputes meant fewer challenges to established authority. And marriage was never meant to be emotionally fulfilling from their perspective. It was meant to function properly within the social system. That's all that mattered. In ancient Rome, the wedding night was not about mutual understanding or building a connection. It was about performing your assigned role correctly. And tradition just assumed you already knew your lines perfectly, whether you actually did or not. As if the relatives standing guard outside the bedroom door weren't creating enough pressure, ancient Romans genuinely believed that the wedding night also had another audience that absolutely could not be dismissed or ignored. The household gods. These were not distant, abstract deities casually lounging around on Mount Olympus, occasionally checking in on human affairs when they felt like it. These were domestic gods. They literally lived in the house with you. They watched absolutely everything. And they were deeply, personally invested in how this particular marriage turned out. Every single Roman home contained a small shrine dedicated to these household spirits. This shrine was usually located near the hearth, the center of the home. These gods protected the family from harm. They oversaw daily life in all its details. And they took very personal interest in major life transitions. Marriage being one of the absolute biggest transitions possible. The wedding night wasn't just a social event or a legal formality. It was a genuine religious milestone. The gods were witnesses to everything that happened, whether you were comfortable with that or not. This belief added yet another massive layer of anxiety to a situation that was already incredibly uncomfortable for everyone involved. The bride and groom were expected to behave properly, respectfully, and in complete accordance with tradition, because misbehavior wasn't just socially embarrassing. It was genuinely offensive to divine beings, who literally lived in the same building as you, and would remember everything. The bride's entry into the household marked her formal introduction to these particular gods. She was no longer protected by her father's household spirits. From this specific night onward, she belonged to an entirely new set of divine supervisors. This was taken extremely seriously. A marriage that somehow displeased the household gods risked infertility, illness, or general misfortune. basically the Roman equivalent of leaving a terrible review with the universe itself. To appease these gods properly, certain specific rituals had to be carefully observed. Offerings were made at the household shrine. Particular words were spoken in the correct order. Actions followed very prescribed patterns that couldn't be altered. Nothing was left to chance or personal interpretation. Roman religion was never really about personal faith or spiritual feelings. It was about procedure. It was about following the correct steps. Do the steps correctly and in the proper order, and the gods would cooperate with you. Skip even one step, and you could enjoy whatever consequences the gods decided to send your way. The groom also had serious responsibilities here. As the head of the household, he was expected to maintain good relations with these gods. A successful wedding night was seen as evidence that the gods genuinely approved of this union. A troubled wedding night invited extremely uncomfortable questions, not just from family members and neighbors, but from fate itself. To modern ears, this idea of constant divine surveillance feels incredibly intrusive. It sounds like an invasion of privacy on a cosmic scale. But to Romans, this was actually comforting and reassuring. The gods provided order. They ensured continuity. They watched over the transition from one generation to the next and kept the entire system functioning properly. In ancient Rome, marriage was never private. Not from family, not from society, not from neighbors, and absolutely not from the gods, who were quietly observing everything from the corner of the room. In ancient Rome, the wedding night did not quietly fade away when the sun finally came up. There was no sleeping in late. There was no lazy morning of rest and recovery. There was absolutely no pretending that nothing monumental and life-changing had just happened. Morning itself was part of the ritual, and it mattered almost as much as everything that had come before it. The new bride woke up with a completely different identity. She was no longer a guest in someone else's home. She was no longer her father's daughter in any legal sense. She was now a full member of her husband's household. This transition had to be visible, deliberate, and properly acknowledged by everyone. Romans absolutely did not trust subtlety or private transformations. If something important had happened, it needed a ceremony attached to it so everyone could witness and confirm it. One of the bride's very first responsibilities was to greet the household gods again. But this time, she approached them not as a visitor or an outsider, but as their new caretaker. She was now responsible for maintaining domestic harmony. She was responsible for overseeing daily religious rituals. She was responsible for ensuring the gods were properly respected and honored. No pressure at all. Just the entire spiritual well-being of the household resting on your shoulders before you'd even had breakfast. The bride also had to begin performing domestic tasks immediately. This wasn't punishment or some kind of test. It was pure symbolism. By engaging in household duties right away, she demonstrated her new role publicly. Marriage was not considered complete until society could actually see that she belonged in this house, working, managing responsibilities, and participating in the daily rhythm of the home. Relatives were often present during this mourning period, watching everything, observing her behavior, occasionally offering advice that was absolutely neither requested nor helpful. This was not an intimate, private mourning. It was an inspection disguised as tradition. Everyone wanted confirmation that the transition had gone smoothly, and that the marriage had been properly established according to all the rules. In some wealthier households, the bride shared a formal morning meal with her husband. This meal reinforced the idea that they were now a social unit. This meal was less about bonding or getting to know each other, and much more about public acknowledgement. Eating together mattered tremendously in Roman culture. It showed order. It showed continuity. It showed that the entire system was still functioning exactly as it should. The groom, meanwhile, stepped fully into his role as household leader starting that very morning. The wedding night marked his assumption of responsibility, not just for a wife, but for future children, property management, and maintaining proper relationships with the gods. Marriage was never presented as a reward for the groom. It was an obligation, a duty, a responsibility he was now expected to fulfill. To modern audiences, this immediate return to structure and routine feels harsh and unforgiving. There's no recovery period allowed. There's no time for emotional processing. There's no acknowledgement that something difficult might have just occurred. But to Romans, this rapid return to normal life was actually reassuring. The faster daily life returned to predictable order, the more successful the marriage appeared to everyone watching. In ancient Rome, marriage was not sealed with romance or emotional connection. It was sealed with routine and the resumption of normal life. And the morning after wasn't treated as an ending to the ritual. It was proof that the system had worked exactly as intended, and that everything was still functioning properly. If you thought the wedding night scrutiny ended with the gods and the guests outside the door finally going home, ancient Rome has one more surprise waiting for you. The women. Specifically, the female relatives of the groom. And yes, they were absolutely paying attention to everything. The morning after the wedding night was not just about religious rituals and household duties. It was also about verification. Roman society was obsessively concerned with legitimacy, with inheritance rights, and with ensuring that everyone followed the rules exactly as tradition demanded. To support this cultural obsession, female relatives of the groom often played the role of observers, advisors, and basically unofficial auditors of the marriage. These women had witnessed this exact ritual many times before in their lives. They knew exactly what was supposed to happen. They knew how it was supposed to look. And they knew what physical signs indicated that everything had gone correctly according to tradition. Their presence was absolutely not meant to be comforting or supportive. It was meant to be thorough and complete. In some Roman households, the bride was discreetly inspected on the morning after. Not aggressively, not cruelly, but undeniably and invasively. This inspection served as confirmation that the marriage had been properly consummated. Romans did not trust private declarations or personal statements. They trusted physical evidence and reliable witnesses. Romance, once again, did not factor into this equation at all. This might sound absolutely shocking to modern ears, but to Romans, it was simply practical and necessary. Marriage created serious legal consequences. It affected property rights. It determined inheritance claims. These were questions that could completely destabilize families if they were left unanswered or ambiguous. Better to be awkward and invasive for a brief moment than to risk absolute chaos emerging years later. The bride, meanwhile, was expected to endure this inspection quietly and without complaint. Complaining would have suggested impropriety, or that she had something to hide. Embarrassment was considered completely irrelevant. Personal dignity was secondary to social order. A respectable Roman woman simply accepted scrutiny as part of her role and her duty. The groom's female relatives also offered extensive advice. Unsolicited advice. Deeply personal advice delivered with complete confidence and zero hesitation. These women framed their involvement as helpful guidance, not as interference in private matters. And in Roman culture, elders, especially female elders, were very rarely questioned about their authority or their right to involve themselves. To modern audiences, this entire morning routine feels intrusive, unnecessary, and deeply violating of basic privacy. It crosses boundaries that we consider sacred and untouchable. But to Romans, this was reassurance. This was confirmation. The marriage had successfully crossed every single required threshold. The transition was completely finished. The system remained intact. After this final moment of verification, the bride's status changed permanently and irreversibly. She was no longer an outsider trying to find her place. She was now completely accountable to her husband's family, to their traditions, and to their expectations for her behavior. In ancient Rome, privacy was not considered a fundamental right. It was considered a luxury. And on your wedding night, and the morning after, it was the very first thing that tradition took away from you, carefully, publicly, and with witnesses who would absolutely remember every single detail. After all the rituals had been completed, after the inspections were finished, after the shouting relatives finally went home, after the watchful gods had been properly honored, and after the symbolic everything had been checked off the list, Roman society finally reached a quiet, almost anticlimactic conclusion. Love was optional. Not forbidden, not actively discouraged, just completely unnecessary at the beginning. In ancient Rome, marriage was never designed to satisfy emotional needs or create personal fulfillment. It was designed to function properly within the social system. If genuine affection happened to develop over time between the husband and wife, that was considered a pleasant side effect. If it didn't develop, well, the system continued operating without any concern whatsoever. Stability mattered infinitely more than happiness. Order mattered more than personal chemistry or emotional connection. This explains why Romans didn't panic or worry if a newly married couple seemed distant, awkward, or uncomfortable with each other after the wedding night. That was completely normal. That was expected. That was how things usually went. Familiarity would come later, after daily routines had settled in and roles had become predictable and comfortable. Romance was something you might accidentally earn over time, not something you deliberately planned for or expected. Roman writers were perfectly comfortable acknowledging this reality openly. Love poems certainly existed in Roman literature, but they were very rarely directed at spouses. Passionate love was often described in Roman writing as disruptive, irrational, and socially inconvenient. Marriage was meant to be calm, predictable, and boring in the most respectable way possible. If you wanted excitement or passion, Roman culture provided plenty of alternatives that existed very conveniently outside the marriage contract. This was not considered hypocrisy in Roman eyes. It was considered practical compartmentalization. Marriage handled lineage and legality. Everything else went somewhere else entirely. The wedding night, then, was never meant to spark passion or create a romantic connection. It was meant to establish a framework, a clear beginning marked by ritual and tradition, not by emotion. Once that framework was solidly in place, the couple could decide how they wanted to exist within it. Politely, dutifully, or perhaps with carefully managed affection if they were lucky. To modern viewers and listeners, this entire approach feels bleak and depressing. We've been trained by our culture to see marriage as the ultimate culmination of romantic love. Romans saw it as the starting point of lifelong responsibility and social duty. Different priorities naturally produce completely different rituals and expectations. And in that specific cultural context, the strange and uncomfortable wedding night actually makes perfect sense. The noise, the crowds, the symbols, all of it served one purpose: to drown out uncertainty with tradition. Love was unpredictable and couldn't be controlled. Tradition was reliable and had worked for centuries. In ancient Rome, marriage did not promise happiness or fulfillment. It promised structure and continuity. And if love happened to arrive later, quietly, and without any ceremony, that was considered a nice bonus, not a requirement or an expectation. By the time the Roman wedding night finally ended, after all the shouting, after all the singing, after all the inspections, after dealing with the gods, after all the symbols, and after the complete and total lack of personal space, one thing should be absolutely crystal clear. The weirdness was completely intentional. None of this happened by accident. None of it was random or poorly thought out. Every single awkward moment served a specific purpose in Roman society. To modern sensibilities, Roman wedding night rituals feel invasive, excessive, and deeply uncomfortable. The lack of privacy alone is enough to make most people physically recoil in horror. But to Romans, privacy was never sacred. Stability was sacred. Order was sacred. Continuity was sacred. And nothing threatened those core values more than ambiguity or uncertainty. The rituals existed specifically to eliminate doubt. Doubt about whether the bride had truly left her old household. Doubt about whether the marriage had been actually completed. Doubt about legitimacy, inheritance, and the future of the family line. Every chant, every torch, every shouted joke worked together to communicate one thing very clearly to everyone present. This transition has happened. It has been witnessed. And it absolutely cannot be undone. The wedding night was never about the couple's personal feelings or their comfort. It was about society reassuring itself that everything was still in its proper place. That the system still worked. That the rules still applied. That the gods were satisfied. That the ancestors were calm. That the future was secured. That's exactly why the rituals were so aggressively public. That's why they were so incredibly loud. That's why they were so uncomfortable for everyone involved. Silence would have invited uncertainty. Privacy would have created room for doubt. And Romans, above absolutely all else, feared disorder and chaos. In a way, these bizarre rituals reveal something deeply honest about Roman culture. They didn't pretend marriage was romantic. They didn't hide its social function behind soft language or idealized love stories. Marriage was a tool, a powerful and necessary tool for society. And tools needed clear instructions and reliable witnesses to function properly. To us looking back, it feels cruel and controlling. To them living in that moment, it felt responsible and necessary for survival. And perhaps that's the strangest part of all this. The rituals were never meant to celebrate love between two people. They were meant to protect society from chaos and disorder. Romance could show up later if it wanted to, quietly and without making a fuss. But tradition always came first. Always. Loudly and without any apology whatsoever. So when we look back at ancient Rome and shake our heads at their absolutely bizarre wedding nights, we're really seeing a culture that valued certainty over comfort. A world where collective survival depended on everyone knowing their exact place and staying firmly in it. In ancient Rome, the wedding night was not a private beginning between two people. It was a public guarantee that society would continue functioning. And weird, as it turns out, was exactly and precisely the point. Part 2, Margaret of Anjou. Now we're going to shift gears completely and travel forward in time, leaving ancient Rome behind and landing in medieval England. And we're going to meet someone who arrived in that country as a frightened teenager, but would eventually become one of the most feared figures in English history. Margaret of Anjou did not arrive in England as a warrior. She didn't arrive as a schemer or as a villain. She arrived as a 15-year-old girl sent across the English Channel in 1445 as part of a diplomatic bargain that was meant to finally end a long, exhausting, expensive war. Her marriage to the English king was not romantic. It wasn't strategic in a flattering way. It wasn't even particularly complimentary to England. It was basically a surrender dressed up nicely as a royal wedding. England gave up valuable territory in France as part of this agreement. They received absolutely no dowry in return. And they gained a teenage queen whose value, at least on paper, was supposed to be her obedience and her willingness to follow instructions. Margaret learned very quickly that England was absolutely not a place where obedient queens succeeded or even survived for very long. Her husband, King Henry VI, was gentle, deeply devout, and catastrophically unfit to actually rule a kingdom. He preferred prayer to politics. He preferred charity to command. At moments of serious crisis, he simply vanished into himself, slipping into long mental collapses that left the entire kingdom completely leaderless. At first, Margaret stayed carefully in the background, doing exactly what was expected of her. She bore insults quietly. She learned about the various factions competing for power at court. She watched powerful men argue endlessly over authority while her husband just stared at the floor. Then England began to seriously crack and fall apart. Noble families started arming themselves. Old grudges resurfaced with new intensity. The crown weakened dramatically, and with it, the fragile peace that had been barely holding the realm together started to collapse. The House of York began to challenge royal authority. Not openly at first, but with the slow, growing confidence of men who could sense blood in the water and weakness in the crown. Margaret saw the danger before most other people did. A queen with no official power learns to read rooms very, very carefully. You learn to notice things that others miss. When Henry collapsed completely in 1453, the comfortable illusion finally ended. The king was technically alive, but England effectively had no ruler at all. Margaret, heavily pregnant at the time, was suddenly the only person anywhere near the throne who could actually take action. This was the specific moment that defined everything that came after. She didn't retreat into prayer like her husband. She didn't ask politely for protection. She stepped forward into power. Her son's birth later that same year changed absolutely everything. Prince Edward wasn't just an heir to the throne. He was proof that the Lancastrian royal line would continue into the next generation. Margaret understood exactly what that meant in a country that was rapidly sliding towards civil war. If the crown fell to the House of York, her son would not be spared or protected. Boys born into disputed thrones very rarely died peacefully in medieval England. From that point forward, Margaret stopped pretending she was merely a queen consort following her husband's instructions. She became a guardian. She became a strategist. And eventually, she became a military commander. England's civil war didn't begin because of Margaret, but it would very soon revolve almost entirely around her and her determination to protect her son's claim to the throne. By the early 1450s, England was being ruled by absence. King Henry VI still technically wore the crown, but his mind drifted far, far away from the actual business of governing a kingdom. During his long mental collapse, he couldn't speak coherently. He couldn't recognize his own child. And he absolutely couldn't govern. Power, as it always does when there's a vacuum, rushed in to fill the empty space. And this time, it was Henry's wife who stepped directly into it. Margaret of Anjou was not officially named regent. England wasn't ready for that level of female authority. A foreign-born woman ruling outright was simply too much for the political imagination of the time to accept. Instead, power became informal, negotiated quietly in private chambers and behind carefully closed doors. Margaret attended royal councils. She influenced important appointments. She blocked her political enemies wherever she could. Every single move she made was immediately criticized. When she spoke up, she was accused of arrogance. When she stayed silent, she was accused of secretly plotting. There was no safe position for her to take. Her greatest threat had a name: Richard of York. He was male, English-born, militarily respected by nobles and soldiers, and dangerously close to the throne by blood. When Henry collapsed, Richard quickly positioned himself as the natural protector of the realm. To Margaret, this wasn't stewardship or temporary assistance. This was a quiet coup disguised as helpful service. She understood something that many powerful men consistently underestimated. Once a rival successfully controls the machinery of government, removing him becomes nearly impossible. What followed wasn't open warfare, not yet. But it was a slow, strangling contest for control. Margaret fought desperately to keep her son recognized as the legitimate heir. Richard fought to weaken her influence and present himself as England's savior from chaos. Noble families across England chose sides. Private armies began to gather. Not marching yet, but definitely ready. This was the real prelude to the Wars of the Roses, though few people yet understood just how deep and bloody the conflict would eventually go. Margaret's reputation hardened considerably during this tense period. Chroniclers portrayed her as domineering, overly emotional, and genuinely dangerous. But these were not neutral descriptions. A woman exercising real political power was, by definition in medieval thinking, seen as unnatural and threatening to proper order. Yet Margaret's actions were brutally logical when you examine them. She was defending her husband's crown and her son's future in a political system specifically designed to strip both away from her. She had no good options, only necessary ones. By the time Henry briefly recovered and Richard was temporarily sidelined, the damage had already been done. Trust between the factions was completely gone. Swords had been drawn, even if they hadn't been swung yet. Margaret had learned the rules of power the hard way. And she was absolutely done pretending she didn't know how to use that power when necessary. Once violence became inevitable, political subtlety died very quickly. The careful maneuvering that had defined Margaret of Anjou's early years in power gave way to something far more dangerous and immediate: open war. The simmering rivalry between Lancaster and York finally exploded in 1455 at the First Battle of St. Albans. It was short, chaotic, and brutally decisive. Yorkist forces emerged victorious. Royal authority collapsed in full public view. And Margaret learned a lesson she would never forget. Mercy would not save her family. The battle left the king once again completely helpless, and the Yorkists dramatically emboldened. Richard of York was reinstated as protector of the realm, a position that placed him closer to the throne than he had ever been before. Margaret was effectively sidelined, pushed away from court, and treated not as a queen, but as a threat that needed to be carefully contained and controlled. For a woman whose power had always been unofficial and informal, this was extremely dangerous territory. Influence only matters when you can actually access the people who make decisions. Margaret responded by doing something that no English queen consort had ever done before. She raised her own political faction. Traveling through the north of England, she built alliances with noble families loyal to Lancaster. She promised protection, royal favor, and survival. This was no longer about politely advising a king. This was about organizing serious resistance. Her court became mobile, constantly moving. Her household became a command center. Chroniclers later mocked her for this behavior, calling her reckless and unfeminine. What they actually meant was that she was effective, and they found it threatening. By 1460, England was no longer pretending it was at peace. The Wars of the Roses were now unmistakably underway. Margaret's forces clashed repeatedly with Yorkist armies, sometimes winning, sometimes retreating, but always returning. She personally oversaw troop movements. She negotiated funding. She coordinated military strategy. While she didn't fight with a sword in her hand, she was absolutely present, directing everything, deciding who lived and who was sacrificed for the greater cause. Her greatest gamble came when she allowed Parliament to declare Richard of York a traitor. It was a bold, completely irreversible political move. By stripping him of all legal legitimacy, she forced the entire conflict into a fight to the death. There would be no reconciliation now. Only victory or complete extinction for one side. When Richard of York was killed at the Battle of Wakefield, Margaret stood at the absolute peak of her power and influence. But war rewards no one for long. Each victory sharpened her enemy's determination. Each difficult decision deepened the bloodshed. And the crown she fought so hard to protect was becoming heavier with every fallen body beneath it. The death of Richard of York should have ended the struggle. For Margaret of Anjou, it was meant to be the turning point, the moment when the war finally tipped decisively in her favor. The Yorkist claimant lay dead. His ambitions were buried with him after the Battle of Wakefield. Margaret had successfully removed her most dangerous rival. But history very rarely rewards clean victories with lasting peace. Instead of peace, England received something much worse. Escalation. Richard's death didn't break the Yorkist cause at all. It actually hardened it. Leadership passed immediately to his son, Edward of York. Young, charismatic, and far more dangerous than his father had ever been. Where Richard had relied on legal arguments and historical precedent, Edward relied on speed, confidence, and absolute battlefield dominance. Margaret had fought one opponent into the ground, only to discover she had unleashed someone even more formidable. In early 1461, Margaret marched south with a large Lancastrian army, confident after her recent success. Her forces won a brutal victory at the Second Battle of St. Albans, freeing King Henry from Yorkist custody. It should have been a triumph. The king was restored. The enemy was pushed back. London lay ahead, seemingly within reach. And yet, everything unraveled. Margaret made a critical mistake. Her army, drawn largely from the north, had a terrible reputation for looting and violence. London's leaders, fearing what her soldiers might do to the city, closed their gates and refused her entry. Edward of York arrived soon after, presenting himself not as a conqueror, but as a savior protecting London. The city welcomed him. Within weeks, he was crowned king as Edward IV. Margaret had won battles, but she had lost the narrative. And in civil war, narrative matters almost as much as swords. The decisive blow came shortly after at the Battle of Towton, one of the bloodiest engagements ever fought on English soil. Snow fell so thick it blinded the archers. Men fought for hours in freezing mud. When it finally ended, the Lancastrian army was completely shattered. Bodies literally filled rivers. England was exhausted. Margaret fled first north, then across the sea, carrying her son with her. She was no longer a ruling queen. She was now an exile. Yet even in defeat, Margaret refused to accept finality. Many people would have disappeared quietly into obscurity. She did the exact opposite. From exile, she plotted return. She sought allies. She prepared for another attempt. The crown had slipped from her grasp, but the war, she believed with absolute certainty, was not yet finished. Exile did not soften Margaret of Anjou. It sharpened her. Forced from England after the catastrophe at Towton, she crossed borders that stripped her of titles but not of ambition. With her went her husband, Henry VI, and their young son, Prince Edward, the last fragile symbol of the Lancastrian claim to the throne. England was lost for now, but Margaret did not behave like someone who had been defeated. She behaved like someone who was regrouping and preparing for the next round. Her years in exile were marked by constant humiliation and exhausting endurance. Courts that had once treated her as a queen now saw her as a political liability. She moved between Scotland, France, and sympathetic noble households, constantly negotiating for protection and money. The irony was bitter. She had once commanded armies. Now she begged for ships. Yet even here, Margaret proved impossible to erase. She remained politically useful, and she knew it. France became her most important refuge. Though her family connections were strained and her homeland unstable, she leveraged every remaining tie she had. She bargained her entire future on one thing: her son. Prince Edward wasn't just her child. He was her political weapon. As long as he lived, the Lancastrian cause could not be declared completely dead. Every negotiation, every plea for support centered on him. Margaret was no longer fighting for a crown she personally wore. She was fighting for one she hoped her son might someday claim. Meanwhile, England continued to bleed without her. Edward IV ruled confidently, but his grip was not as secure as it appeared. Old loyalties simmered beneath the surface. Nobles shifted sides. Discontent brewed quietly. Margaret watched all of this from afar, waiting. Exile teaches patience, especially when impatience has already cost you everything you once had. Her chance came unexpectedly. The Earl of Warwick, once Edward's greatest supporter, turned against him in a spectacular political reversal. Suddenly, the impossible became plausible again. Margaret the Exile found herself negotiating with former enemies. Pride had no place here. Survival required flexibility. She agreed to alliances that would have been absolutely unthinkable years earlier, all for the chance to return. In 1471, Margaret's efforts bore fruit. Henry was briefly restored to the throne. For a moment, the world seemed to rewind. But restoration was fragile, and Margaret was not even on English soil to protect it. This time, fate would move faster than her carefully laid plans. The restoration of Henry VI in 1471 was fragile from the very moment it began. It existed on paper more than in reality, propped up by shifting alliances and exhausted loyalties. Margaret of Anjou, the architect of this unlikely return, wasn't even present in England when it happened. Delayed by storms at sea, she arrived too late to control events that demanded immediate force. While Henry sat passively on the throne once more, real power lay elsewhere. Edward IV had not accepted defeat. He returned swiftly from his own exile with experienced troops, money, and momentum. The country that had briefly welcomed Henry's restoration now hesitated. No one wanted another prolonged, bloody war. Margaret's return should have unified the Lancastrian cause. Instead, it exposed its fatal weakness. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Margaret was present this time, watching the fate of her family play out on the battlefield. Her army was smaller, less disciplined, and completely outmaneuvered. The Yorkists crushed the Lancastrian forces with brutal efficiency. There was no heroic reversal, no last-minute miracle. It was slaughter. The true devastation came after the fighting ended. Margaret's son, Prince Edward, was captured and killed. Whether he died in battle or was executed afterward mattered little. The result was the same. The Lancastrian line was extinguished. The future Margaret had spent decades fighting to protect vanished in a single day. Few moments in medieval politics were so absolutely final. Shortly after, Henry VI died in captivity in the Tower of London, almost certainly murdered. With his death, the war effectively ended. Margaret was captured alive. For the first time in her adult life, there was no cause left to defend, no army to raise, no crown to reclaim. Edward IV showed her mercy of a calculated kind. She wasn't executed. Instead, she was held prisoner for several years, a living reminder of a war now over. Eventually, she was ransomed back to France. It wasn't a return home in triumph. It was removal. Margaret left England as she had entered it decades earlier, stripped of power, defined by other people's decisions. But unlike the frightened teenager who first crossed the Channel, this woman carried the weight of an entire kingdom's collapse on her shoulders. After decades of constant command, crisis after crisis, and relentless motion, Margaret of Anjou entered a phase of life that history records only faintly. This wasn't because nothing happened. It was because nothing dramatic remained to record. Once ransomed back to France, Margaret became something rare for a woman like her. Politically irrelevant. For someone who had lived at the absolute center of war, conflict, and power struggles, this quiet was not peace. It was erasure. She returned to a homeland that barely recognized her anymore. France had changed dramatically. And so had she. The resources that once supported her ambitions were gone. Her powerful relatives were dead or distracted by their own struggles. Margaret lived in reduced circumstances, dependent on a modest pension and the charity of the French crown. The woman who once negotiated alliances between kingdoms now had no leverage at all. What makes this period particularly striking is not what Margaret did, but what she endured. She had lost her husband, her son, her crown, and her country. Most medieval women disappeared quietly after such losses, absorbed into convents or family households. Margaret did neither. She remained visible enough to be remembered, but powerless enough to be ignored. Chroniclers who once painted her as a monster now barely mentioned her at all. This silence was deliberate. Victors controlled memory, and the Yorkist regime had no interest in preserving the image of a queen who had nearly destroyed them. Margaret was reframed not as a commander or strategist, but as a cautionary tale. The dangerous foreign woman whose ambition brought ruin. Her years of exile conveniently reinforced that narrative. She was no longer a threat, so she could be simplified into a moral lesson. Yet survival itself was a quiet form of defiance. Margaret lived until 1482, long enough to see England stabilize under a new order built partly on the ruins she had helped create. She never returned to England. She never saw her son's grave. She never regained a title that mattered. But she also never apologized. There is no evidence that Margaret expressed regret for her actions. No surviving confession. No plea for forgiveness. That absence speaks volumes. She had played the game of power by the same rules as the men around her, and she had paid the same price for losing. The difference was that history punished her ambition far more harshly than it punished theirs. By the time she died, Margaret of Anjou was no longer feared or hated. She was simply inconvenient to remember. And yet, the wars she fought and reshaped England permanently. Silence could not undo that. Long after her armies were destroyed and her cause extinguished, Margaret of Anjou continued to fight a different kind of war. One she could not win. This battle was over memory. And in that arena, she was completely defenseless. Medieval chroniclers did not struggle to explain civil war. They struggled to explain female power. Margaret solved that problem for them perfectly. She was cast as the cause rather than a participant, the spark rather than the fuel. England's decades of instability were folded neatly into her personality. Foreign, emotional, domineering, unnatural. The men who armed the kingdom, betrayed allies, and butchered rivals faded into complexity. Margaret became the villain who made it all happen. This narrative hardened quickly. Writers accused her of cruelty, ambition, and bloodlust, often exaggerating or outright inventing scenes to make their point. She was described as shouting orders, humiliating enemies, and reveling in executions. These images survived not because they were accurate, but because they were useful. They explain chaos without questioning the system that produced it. What's striking is how selective this moral outrage was. Male nobles who switched sides repeatedly were called pragmatic. Kings who plunged England into war were called unfortunate. A queen who refused to surrender her son's inheritance was called monstrous. Margaret did not behave unusually for a political leader of her time. She behaved unusually for a woman, and that was unforgivable. Later generations inherited these judgments uncritically. Plays and poems reduced her to a caricature, a screaming harridan haunting battlefields and courts. Even centuries later, her name became shorthand for disorder. It was easier to remember her as a warning than to confront the uncomfortable truth that England's civil war was driven by structural failure, not one woman's will. Modern historians have been less forgiving of that simplification. When stripped of myth, Margaret emerges not as a destabilizer, but as someone responding to crisis. She acted because no one else would. She fought because surrender meant annihilation. Her mistakes were real, but they were shared by nearly every man who led armies in the same war. History rarely asks whether a woman in power had better options. It asks why she dared to have power at all. Margaret of Anjou became infamous not because she failed, but because she tried. And in a medieval world that preferred obedient queens, that attempt was unforgivable. When Margaret of Anjou died in 1482, there was no ceremony worthy of a queen who had once commanded armies and bent kingdoms around her will. She passed quietly in France, far from the land that had consumed her life. England barely noticed, and yet her shadow lingered longer than many crowned kings. Margaret's true legacy is not found in victories or defeats, but in what she represented. She was one of the first queens in English history to exercise power openly and relentlessly during a civil war, not as a regent in name, not as a symbolic figurehead, but as a decision-maker. She negotiated alliances, raised armies, and made ruthless choices under pressure. That alone placed her outside the boundaries medieval society had drawn for women. The tragedy of Margaret's life is not that she failed, but that success was never a stable option. Every path available to her carried catastrophe. If she remained passive, her husband would be replaced and her son eliminated. If she acted, she became the embodiment of disorder. Power punished her either way. She chose action. The England that emerged after the Wars of the Roses was shaped by the conflict she fought in. Stronger monarchy, reduced noble independence, a deeper fear of civil war. Later rulers learned from the chaos she helped expose. Even the Tudor dynasty, which benefited from the war's aftermath, ruled a country transformed by decades of bloodshed. Margaret did not win the crown for her son, but she helped end an era where weak kings could drift without consequence. In that sense, she was not simply a losing side in history's ledger. She was part of the mechanism that forced change. Civil wars do not have heroes, but they do have catalysts. Margaret was one of them. What remains striking is her refusal to disappear when history demanded it. She did not fade gracefully. She did not retreat into silence when power slipped away. She endured exile, imprisonment, and loss without renouncing her cause. That endurance unsettles traditional narratives more than her battles ever did. Margaret of Anjou is often remembered as a warning. She should be remembered as a case study in survival under impossible conditions. She was not England's downfall. She was a woman who refused to let a broken system quietly destroy her family. And for that defiance, history made her unforgettable, even when it tried not to. Part 3. The Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses did not begin with banners raised or armies marching dramatically across fields. They began quietly inside a kingdom already exhausted and falling apart. England in the mid-15th century was not stable enough to survive a weak ruler. And unfortunately for everyone involved, that was exactly what it had. At the center of the collapse stood Henry VI, a man who inherited a crown, but not the temperament to wear it. Henry was gentle, deeply religious, and painfully indecisive. These qualities might have suited a monk perfectly. For a medieval king, they were absolutely disastrous. England was still reeling from the slow collapse of its territories in France. Wars that had drained the treasury and humiliated the nobility. Soldiers returned home unpaid. Merchants suffered from instability. Law and order weakened as powerful lords began enforcing their own version of justice. The king meanwhile prayed. As Henry retreated from authority, power began to leak outward like water from a cracked vessel. Great noble families filled the vacuum, each convinced that they, not the crown, were the true guardians of England. Rivalries hardened. Private armies grew. Loyalty became conditional. The crown was no longer a symbol of unity. It became a prize waiting to be claimed. The most dangerous consequence of Henry's weakness was uncertainty. No one knew who truly ruled. During the king's periods of mental collapse, England effectively had no monarch at all. Councils argued endlessly. Regents were appointed and undermined. Every decision sparked resentment. Into this chaos stepped Richard of York, a powerful noble with royal blood and the confidence to use it. He did not declare himself king. He did something more threatening. He presented himself as necessary. What followed was not open rebellion, but careful positioning. Noble families chose sides quietly. Old grudges resurfaced under new justifications. The royal court became a battlefield of whispers and alliances. The symbols of war were already visible before the first sword was drawn. Coats of arms replaced trust. Kinship was weighed against opportunity. England was not yet at war with itself, but it was no longer whole. The Wars of the Roses were not caused by ambition alone. They were born from a kingdom that could no longer hold itself together. Once authority fractured, violence was only a matter of timing. Once authority fractured, lineage became weaponized. In theory, the English crown followed a clear line of succession. In practice, 15th century genealogy was a mess of overlapping claims, dead heirs, and convenient interpretations. The houses of Lancaster and York were not outsiders fighting for the throne. They were family. And that made the conflict far more dangerous. Both sides descended from Edward III, whose many sons had produced too many legitimate claimants for a single crown. The Lancastrian kings ruled through Henry VI, descended from Edward's third son. The Yorkists traced their claim through both the second and fourth sons, which on paper gave them a stronger hereditary argument. That fact mattered less than how often it was repeated. In medieval politics, repetition could turn theory into truth. What truly poisoned the situation was that these blood claims existed in a world already flooded with armed men. England's nobility maintained private retinues loyal not to the crown, but to individual lords. When disputes arose, they were not settled in courtrooms. They were settled with steel. Every legal argument came with a shadow army behind it. The rivalry hardened when Richard of York positioned himself as protector of the realm during Henry's breakdowns. Officially, he claimed to be safeguarding England. Unofficially, he was proving he could run the kingdom better than the king. Each time he governed competently, the idea of replacing Henry felt less radical. Lancastrian supporters saw this as creeping treason. Yorkist supporters saw it as inevitable reform. Neutral nobles watched carefully, waiting to see which side offered survival. Loyalty shifted, not based on morality, but timing. Choosing too early was dangerous. Choosing too late was fatal. What makes this phase critical is that war was still avoidable. There were negotiations, compromises, half-measures, but none addressed the real issue. England had too many powerful men and no strong center to restrain them. Every truce simply postponed violence. Every agreement bred suspicion. By the time the first armies gathered, the question was no longer who had the better claim. It was who would strike first. In a system where weakness invited removal, restraint became a liability. Bloodlines provided justification. Swords provided resolution. And England was rapidly running out of reasons not to use them. The moment diplomacy collapsed, violence rushed in to replace it. The first true rupture came in 1455 at the Battle of St. Albans. A short, savage clash that shattered any illusion that England's crisis could be solved quietly. What had once been whispered arguments over bloodlines and governance turned into open killing in the streets. The Wars of the Roses had begun, and there would be no clean way out. At St. Albans, the forces of Richard of York struck decisively against Lancastrian loyalists. Several of the king's closest allies were killed. Not in grand heroic combat, but in close chaotic fighting. The king himself, Henry VI, was captured. That single moment sent a clear message across the realm. The crown could be seized, and the sky would not fall. From then on, restraint became weakness. Noble families scrambled to reassess their positions. Some switched sides immediately. Others armed themselves and waited. The countryside filled with small bands of soldiers wearing household colors rather than royal insignia. England was no longer fighting foreign wars. It was consuming itself. What made this conflict especially brutal was its intimacy. The battles were not distant affairs between strangers. They were fought between cousins, former allies, and neighbors. Noblemen who had shared tables now shared battlefields. Prisoners were rarely spared because mercy invited revenge later. Executions followed victories with chilling speed. Power changed hands not through law but through survival. The violence also reshaped political behavior. Parliament became a weapon rather than a forum. Victors used it to legitimize their rule, declare enemies traitors, and confiscate lands. Losing a battle no longer meant temporary disgrace. It meant legal erasure. Titles vanished. Families were destroyed. Estates were redistributed to the loyal. As battles multiplied, England learned a dangerous lesson. Force worked. Each successful coup encouraged the next. Each deposition normalized the idea that kings could be replaced. The crown lost its sacred distance. It became another prize on the field. By the late 1450s, England was trapped in a cycle it could not break. Victory demanded total defeat of the enemy. Compromise became impossible. Politics had failed. Blades now dictated the future. And with every clash, the cost of ending the war grew higher. Civil war has a way of accelerating careers. Men who might have spent decades climbing courtly ladders suddenly found themselves standing on battlefields deciding the fate of England. No one benefited more from this brutal compression of time than Edward IV, the young son of Richard of York. Where his father had moved carefully, Edward moved fast. And in a war defined by momentum, speed mattered enormously. After Richard of York was killed in battle, many expected the Yorkist cause to collapse. Instead, it transformed. Edward was tall, confident, and visibly martial in a way that appealed to exhausted nobles and common soldiers alike. He did not argue genealogy in council chambers. He argued with victories. In early 1461, he marched south, gathering support not through legality, but through presence. Towns opened their gates. Men joined his banner because he looked like a king who could actually win. His coronation as king did not end the war. It intensified it. For the first time, England had two competing monarchies, each claiming legitimacy and each willing to kill to enforce it. Edward's greatest test came at the Battle of Towton, fought in appalling conditions. Snow blinded archers. Mud swallowed the wounded. The scale of death shocked even hardened veterans. When it ended, the Lancastrian army was destroyed, and with it, any immediate challenge to Edward's rule. Towton did not bring peace. It brought dominance. Edward IV ruled decisively, redistributing lands, rewarding loyalty, and crushing resistance. For a time, it worked. The kingdom, exhausted by years of chaos, accepted stability even if it was enforced with fear. England had not healed, but it had paused. Yet the war had changed the rules forever. Edward's rise proved that a crown could be taken and held by force alone. Birth mattered, but battlefield success mattered more. This lesson lingered, unsettling every noble who watched it unfold. If one king could be overthrown, so could another. Beneath the surface of Edward's reign, resentment brewed. Former allies felt sidelined. Old loyalties resurfaced. The war had crowned a victor, but it had not resolved the disease that caused it. England was stable only so long as Edward remained unchallenged. And history had already shown how temporary that could be. Once the crown proved movable, loyalty became negotiable. The middle years of the Wars of the Roses were defined less by ideology than by betrayal. Alliances shifted not because beliefs changed, but because survival demanded flexibility. Nowhere was this more visible than in the rise and fall of the man later known as the Kingmaker. The Earl of Warwick had been instrumental in placing Edward IV on the throne. He commanded armies, negotiated marriages, and projected authority on Edward's behalf. For a time, Warwick was the engine of Yorkist power. But civil war rewards ambition poorly. As Edward grew more confident, he relied less on his former mentor. Decisions were made without Warwick's approval. Honors went elsewhere. Influence slipped. Warwick's response was not loyalty. It was recalculation. In a move that stunned England, Warwick turned against the king he had helped create. He allied with his former enemies, the Lancastrians, proving that in this war, yesterday's traitor could become today's ally. The reversal was not moral. It was strategic. Warwick believed he could control a restored Lancastrian monarchy more easily than an independent Yorkist king. England reeled from the shock. If the most powerful noble in the realm could switch sides, no alliance was safe. Armies marched again. Battles reignited old wounds. Edward was briefly driven into exile. In an extraordinary reversal, Henry VI was restored to the throne. Not through strength, but because others moved him there like a political prop. This period exposed the true nature of the conflict. The war was no longer about Lancaster versus York. It was about control. Kings were symbols. Power lay with whoever commanded men, money, and timing. Parliament endorsed whoever stood victorious long enough to summon it. Law followed force, not the other way around. For ordinary people, this chaos was devastating. Lands were seized and reassigned repeatedly. Families were punished for backing the wrong side at the wrong moment. Justice depended on which banner flew overhead that week. The nobility played a lethal game of musical chairs, and England paid the price. By now, betrayal was no longer shocking. It was expected. The only real question left was who would betray whom next, and whether England could survive another reversal. By the early 1470s, the Wars of the Roses had reached a dangerous stage. This was no longer a struggle to claim power. It was a struggle to survive the consequences of having claimed it. The same tactics that had won crowns now tore alliances apart. The war had begun eating the very men who sustained it. The return of Edward IV from exile was swift and brutal. He did not come back cautiously or with half measures. He came back to finish the job. Former allies who hesitated were crushed. Former enemies who surrendered were not always spared. Edward had learned the lesson the war taught best. Mercy extended the conflict. The decisive moment came in a rapid sequence of battles. Warwick, the great kingmaker, was killed in combat. Stripped of the power he once wielded so casually. His death marked a turning point. If the man who could make kings could also be destroyed, then no one was untouchable. Power had become lethal, even to those who held it longest. The final blow to the Lancastrian cause came shortly afterward. Their last serious army was defeated. Their hope for restoration collapsed in a single afternoon. Henry VI, once king, then prisoner, then king again, vanished from relevance entirely. He died in captivity, almost certainly murdered. His death was not dramatic. It was administrative. The war had learned how to erase people efficiently. What followed was not peace, but exhaustion. England had lost a generation of nobles. Entire family lines had been wiped out. Lands changed hands so often that ownership barely mattered. Authority survived, but trust did not. The monarchy emerged stronger in theory and harsher in practice. Kings would rule decisively now, because indecision had proven fatal. Yet even with Edward restored, the war refused to end cleanly. Too many men had learned that crowns could fall. Too many grudges remained unpaid. The violence slowed, but it did not disappear. It waited. This phase of the conflict revealed its true cost. The Wars of the Roses were no longer about who should rule England. They were about whether England could ever return to stability after teaching itself that power belonged to whoever seized it fastest. The war had solved nothing. It had only changed who survived long enough to write the rules. By the late 1470s, England was quieter, but not healed. The Wars of the Roses had slowed into something more unsettling than open battle. Suspicion. Edward IV sat firmly on the throne. Yet everyone understood how temporary that security could be. Too many kings had fallen too quickly for confidence to come easily. Edward ruled with greater authority than any monarch since the war began. He rewarded loyalty decisively and crushed dissent before it could grow. Noble independence was curtailed. Private armies were discouraged. The lesson of the war was clear. Strong kings survived. Weak ones vanished. For a time, England accepted this arrangement. Stability, even enforced, was preferable to chaos. But the war had trained England to expect challenges. When Edward died suddenly, the fragile balance snapped again. His heir was a child. Power shifted to regents and protectors. Old instincts returned immediately. The crown once again looked vulnerable. And vulnerability invited ambition. Within months, the boy king disappeared from history. And Richard III took the throne. The justification was legal. The result was familiar. Richard's reign was short, tense, and shadowed by doubt. He ruled competently, but legitimacy haunted him. In a kingdom trained by decades of civil war, perception mattered as much as law. Every rumor carried weight. Every alternative claimant felt plausible simply because replacement had become normal. Into this uncertainty stepped a new figure, Henry Tudor. His claim to the throne was weak, tangled, and laughable on paper. In any other century, it would have gone nowhere. But this was post-war England. Bloodlines mattered less than momentum. Henry promised an end to the cycle. More importantly, he offered exhausted nobles a chance to stop choosing sides every decade. Support gathered slowly, not out of passion, but fatigue. Men who had survived the wars wanted finality. They did not need Henry to be perfect. They needed him to end the killing. As Henry landed in England, the war's final phase took shape. It was no longer Lancaster versus York. It was exhaustion versus uncertainty. England stood at a crossroads shaped by 30 years of betrayal and bloodshed, waiting to see whether the crown would fall one last time or finally stay put. By 1485, England had reached the limit of its tolerance for uncertainty. 3 decades of shifting crowns had trained the kingdom to expect collapse, yet desperately crave finality. The last act of the Wars of the Roses would not be long, but it would be decisive. It centered on 2 men who understood exactly what was at stake. On one side stood Richard III, a hardened veteran of civil war. He had grown up surrounded by betrayal and bloodshed and ruled with a clear understanding of how fragile power could be. Richard was not incompetent nor universally hated. He governed firmly, attempted legal reforms, and projected strength, but legitimacy clung to him poorly. Rumors about the disappearance of his nephews followed him everywhere, whether fair or not. In a kingdom shaped by suspicion, doubt was fatal. Opposing him was Henry Tudor, an unlikely challenger whose claim to the throne was weak by dynastic standards. What Henry lacked in pedigree, he compensated for in timing. He positioned himself not as a conqueror, but as an ending. His promise was simple. Stop the war. End the cycle. Marry rival bloodlines. And give England a rest. Their confrontation came at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Unlike earlier clashes, this was not a chaotic sprawl of shifting loyalties. It was focused, tense, and final. Richard fought aggressively, even recklessly, leading a direct charge toward Henry himself. For a moment, it nearly worked. History balanced on a knife's edge. Then alliances shifted one last time. Key nobles withheld support at the critical moment. Richard was isolated, surrounded, killed on the battlefield. His death was not ceremonial or negotiated. It was abrupt and violent, fitting for a war that had consumed kings without mercy. With Richard's fall, the cycle finally broke. Henry Tudor was crowned as Henry VII, not because he was the strongest claimant, but because he was the last one standing. The crown passed not through purity of blood, but through exhaustion of alternatives. Bosworth did not simply decide a king. It ended a habit. England had spent 30 years learning that rulers could be replaced by force. Now it learned something new. That endless replacement led only to ruin. The battlefield where Richard fell marked the moment England chose closure over chaos. Even if that closure came at the point of a sword. When the Wars of the Roses finally ended, England did not celebrate. It exhaled. 30 years of dynastic violence had not produced a clear moral victory, only a profound lesson in what civil war costs. The kingdom that emerged after Bosworth was quieter, but deeply changed, shaped by loss rather than triumph. The most immediate consequence was the destruction of the old nobility. Entire family lines had been wiped out on battlefields or executed after defeats. Titles vanished. Estates were confiscated and reassigned repeatedly until loyalty became inseparable from survival. This thinning of the aristocracy weaken the power of great lords permanently. England would never again tolerate a nobility strong enough to challenge the crown so openly. From this devastation rose a new kind of monarchy. Henry VII ruled cautiously, not because he was timid, but because he understood the danger of instability. He avoided unnecessary wars, controlled noble power tightly, and treated rebellion as a disease to be eliminated early. The crown became less theatrical and more administrative. Kingship shifted from personal dominance to institutional control. The war also left a psychological scar. England had learned that kings could be deposed, imprisoned, and killed. The idea of sacred monarchy had been shattered. Future rulers governed with that knowledge always in mind. Authority would be enforced more carefully now, backed by law, finance, and surveillance rather than personal charisma alone. For ordinary people, the wars had been catastrophic. Crops were destroyed, towns pillaged, and justice distorted by shifting allegiances. The conflict had rarely been about ideology for them. It was about whose soldiers were passing through this year. Peace, when it finally came, was welcomed not as victory, but as relief. Perhaps the most lasting legacy was cultural. The Wars of the Roses became a warning baked into English identity. Writers, chroniclers, and later dramatists treated the period as a descent into madness, where ambition ran unchecked and loyalty meant nothing. It became a story England told itself about what happens when power fractures. The wars ended in 1485, but their consequences echoed for centuries. They reshaped monarchy, destroyed old elites, and taught England to fear internal division more than foreign threats. The country survived, but only by abandoning the illusion that blood alone could guarantee stability. In the end, the Wars of the Roses were not about who deserved the crown. They were about how fragile a kingdom becomes when everyone thinks they do. Part 4. Medieval Queenship. Medieval queenship did not begin with marriage. It began with spectacle. A woman was not truly a queen until the realm saw her become one. Coronation was the moment when a bride crossed into power, and it was designed to be absolutely unforgettable. Bells rang. Clergy processed. Nobles watched closely, and the queen was transformed in full view of the political elite. This was not decoration. It was authorization. A queen's coronation echoed the king's in structure, though never in scale. She was anointed with holy oil, crowned, and seated beside the king, marking her as chosen not only by marriage, but by God. The ritual mattered because medieval authority was fragile. Power needed visible reinforcement. Without a coronation, a queen's position was weaker, her influence easier to challenge, and her legitimacy open to doubt. This is why some queens fought fiercely to be crowned quickly. Delay created vulnerability. A crowned queen could issue charters, hold lands in her own right, and act as a legal partner to the king. An uncrowned queen was merely a wife with a title. The difference was enormous. Ceremony translated into leverage. The coronation also taught the queen her role. She processed slowly, dressed in specific colors, surrounded by clergy and noble women. Every movement was choreographed. She learned where she could stand, when she could speak, and how she was meant to be seen. Queenship was as much about restraint as authority. Power was permitted only when expressed correctly. Importantly, the ceremony sent a message to the nobility. The queen was now part of the machinery of rule. She could intercede, influence appointments, and serve as a bridge between factions. Ignoring her was no longer polite distance. It was political risk. History offers many examples of queens who understood this instinctively. Eleanor of Aquitaine, crowned twice in her lifetime, used ceremony to reinforce her status in two kingdoms. She did not rely on charm alone. She relied on visibility. Being seen mattered as much as being capable. Medieval politics ran on symbols, and the queen was one of its most carefully managed symbols. Her coronation was the first lesson in that reality. From that day forward, everything she did would be watched, interpreted, and remembered. Queenship was not granted quietly. It was announced loudly, so that no one could later pretend it did not exist. When a medieval king was absent, incapacitated, or dead, the crown did not simply pause. Someone had to rule. In those moments, Queen stepped into one of the most delicate roles in medieval politics. Regency. A regent queen did not replace the king. She preserved him, or more often his heir, until power could safely pass on. Regency was never automatic. It had to be justified, negotiated, and constantly defended. A queen ruling for a child king or an absent husband walked a narrow path. She was expected to govern effectively while pretending she was only holding the seat warm. Too much authority looked like ambition. Too little invited chaos. Every decision carried risk. What made Queen suitable for regency was not sentiment, but lineage. A queen was tied to the ruling dynasty by marriage and motherhood. She embodied continuity. Nobles might distrust each other, but they trusted bloodlines. The queen governing in her son's name was seen as protecting the future of the realm, not advancing herself. That distinction mattered enormously. Yet regency was rarely peaceful. Councils formed around the queen, often dominated by powerful men eager to guide or restrain her. Regents were watched closely. Military failures, unpopular taxes, or political unrest were blamed on her judgment. Success, meanwhile, was often credited to advisors. Queens were held responsible without being fully acknowledged. Some regent queens mastered this balance with remarkable skill. Blanche of Castile ruled France during her son's minority with firmness that shocked her critics. She led armies, crushed rebellions, and negotiated alliances, all while insisting she acted solely as a mother defending her child's crown. Her authority was real, but carefully framed. Others faced harsher resistance. Isabella of France, acting against her husband, crossed the invisible line between regency and usurpation. History punished her for it. The difference was not competence. It was perception. Regency revealed a central truth of medieval queenship. Women could rule, but only under specific conditions. They needed the cover of necessity, the language of duty, and the promise that their power was temporary. Queens who respected those rules often governed effectively. Queens who broke them were remembered as dangerous. Behind the pageantry and ceremony, regency was where queenship became unmistakably political. It was here that queens proved they were not passive figures in medieval rule, but essential stabilizers in a system that frequently failed without them. Behind the pageantry and ceremony, medieval courts were not just places of ritual. They were machines for distributing favor, access, and survival. Within them, queens exercised a form of power that was subtle, deniable, and extraordinarily effective. This power flowed through etiquette. Who stood closest? Who spoke first? Who was invited? Who waited? These details were not social trivia. They were political signals. A queen's household was her primary base of influence. Ladies-in-waiting, chaplains, secretaries, and attendants were not chosen randomly. They came from noble families whose loyalty mattered. By selecting who served her, the queen quietly shaped alliances. To place a woman near the queen was to elevate her entire family. To remove her was a warning. No proclamation was needed. Everyone understood. Access to the queen was access to the king. Petitioners who could not reach the monarch often sought the queen instead. Intercession became one of her most powerful tools. A queen could present requests as mercy rather than policy, softening decisions that might otherwise provoke backlash. This made her invaluable and dangerous. She could advance causes without appearing to govern. Etiquette reinforced this influence. Court rituals dictated when the queen appeared, how she was approached, and who was permitted to speak to her directly. These rules created bottlenecks. If the queen chose to delay a meeting or grant it publicly, the message was unmistakable. Favor was being displayed or withdrawn in real time. Queens who understood this system could dominate court politics without issuing a single order. Philippa of Hainaut famously used intercession to temper royal severity, earning loyalty from subjects and nobles alike. Her reputation for mercy was not accidental. It was cultivated, strategic, and politically stabilizing. The Queen's Court also functioned as a parallel institution. While the king handled warfare and law, the Queen managed culture, charity, and diplomacy. Visiting envoys observed her household closely. A well-run court signaled stability. A chaotic one suggested weakness. Queens who maintained order enhanced their dynasty's legitimacy. Importantly, etiquette protected queens as well as empowered them. By acting through custom rather than command, they avoided direct confrontation. If challenged, a queen could retreat behind tradition. She was not asserting power. she was following precedent. This ambiguity was deliberate. Medieval queenship thrived in these gray zones. Ceremony, manners, and household routines formed a language of power understood by everyone at court. Queens fluent in that language could shape outcomes quietly, leaving few fingerprints behind. In a world where overt female authority was suspect, etiquette was not a constraint. It was a shield and a weapon. In medieval Europe, a queen's body was not private. It was political territory. Marriage placed her at the center of dynastic strategy, and lineage determined whether a kingdom remained stable or slid into crisis. Queens were expected to produce heirs quickly, visibly, and successfully. Failure was not interpreted as misfortune. It was treated as a threat to the realm. The queen's marriage itself was a diplomatic act. She arrived with treaties woven into her dowry, alliances encoded in her ancestry, and expectations written by men she had never met. Once crowned, her primary duty was continuity. An heir secured peace. The absence of one invited rebellion. Every pregnancy was watched. Every miscarriage whispered about. The queen's health became a matter of state. Motherhood did not reduce a queen's political importance. It intensified it. A queen who bore a male heir gained leverage immediately. She became the guardian of the future, a living guarantee that the dynasty would continue. This status protected her influence and, in some cases, allowed her to act decisively in moments of crisis. A childless queen, by contrast, stood on unstable ground. Her value could be questioned. Her position could be replaced. This pressure shaped behavior at court. Queens cultivated religious devotion publicly, commissioning prayers for fertility and safe childbirth. They distributed alms, patronized saints associated with motherhood, and framed their pregnancies as divine events. These acts were not superstition alone. They were political communication. A fertile queen signaled divine favor. An infertile one raised dangerous doubts. Lineage also gave queens leverage beyond the nursery. Through their children, queens built alliances. Marriages arranged by queens extended influence across borders. A daughter married into a rival house could stabilize decades of tension. A son betrothed strategically could prevent war. Queens were often deeply involved in these negotiations, even when men claimed final authority. Some queens understood this power instinctively. Margaret of Anjou fought relentlessly to protect her son's claim, because she knew what his survival meant politically. Her authority flowed from motherhood as much as marriage. To attack her son was to attack the future she represented. In medieval queenship, lineage was currency. The womb was a site of power. And queens who navigated this reality successfully could shape the fate of kingdoms without ever stepping onto a battlefield. Beyond ceremony and motherhood, medieval queenship rested heavily on diplomacy. Queens were not merely decorative companions to kings. They were living bridges between courts. Born into foreign dynasties, raised in multilingual environments, and trained in etiquette from childhood, queens were uniquely suited to manage relationships that kings often complicated with pride or threat. A queen's foreign origin, so often criticized, was actually an advantage. She carried kinship ties that could soften hostilities and open channels unavailable to male rulers. Letters sent in a queen's name carried a different tone. They invoked family, obligation, and shared blood rather than dominance. In an age where insult could spark war, this mattered enormously. Queens frequently hosted envoys, negotiated marriages, and mediated disputes behind closed doors. These were not informal chats. They were structured exchanges governed by ritual, gift-giving, and carefully chosen language. A queen could advance peace without publicly binding the crown. If negotiations failed, the king could deny involvement. If they succeeded, stability followed quietly. This deniability made queens ideal negotiators. The queen's household again played a crucial role. Foreign ambassadors observed it closely, noting order, generosity, and discipline. A queen who ran a calm, dignified court projected legitimacy. Disorders suggested weakness. Queens who understood this curated their image carefully, knowing reputation traveled faster than armies. Some queens became legendary for their diplomatic skill. Eleanor of Aquitaine moved effortlessly between courts, cultures, and political systems, using charm, intelligence, and lineage to influence outcomes across Europe. Her power did not rely on decrees. It relied on presence. People listened to her because she represented continuity between rival worlds. Queens also acted as internal diplomats. They mediated between hostile nobles, soothed offended families, and repaired alliances damaged by royal decisions. When a king needed to retreat without losing face, the queen often provided the excuse. Mercy granted at her request looked humane rather than weak. This diplomatic role required restraint. Queens who spoke too boldly risked accusations of manipulation. Those who remained too quiet lost relevance. Success lay in balance. The most effective queens made others feel heard, while steering outcomes subtly in their favor. In a medieval world obsessed with honor, queens operated in the margins where honor bent. They persuaded where kings commanded. They softened where crowns hardened. And while treaties bore male signatures, many of them were shaped first in the queen's chamber through conversations history rarely recorded, but deeply felt. If coronations granted queens legitimacy and diplomacy gave them reach, patronage gave them permanence. Medieval queens built power slowly through piety, charity, and cultural sponsorship. Arenas where female authority was not only accepted but expected. This was not soft power in the modern sense. It was structural. Queens were major patrons of religious institutions. They founded monasteries, endowed churches, commissioned altarpieces, and supported clerical careers. These acts signaled devotion, but they also created networks of obligation. The convent funded by the queen prayed for her family, supported her political interests, and reinforced her reputation as divinely favored. In a deeply religious society, moral authority translated into political insulation. Piety also protected queens from criticism. A visibly devout queen was harder to accuse of ambition or corruption. Her actions could be framed as service rather than strategy. This did not mean queens were naive. It meant they understood optics. Public prayer, pilgrimages, and almsgiving were carefully staged reminders that the queen stood on the side of God and order. Patronage extended beyond religion. Queens sponsored artists, chroniclers, poets, and scholars. The stories told at court mattered. Chronicles shaped memory. Songs reinforced loyalty. A queen who controlled cultural output influenced how her reign and her dynasty would be remembered. Silence could erase enemies. Praise could elevate allies. Charity was another key tool. Queens distributed food during famines, ransomed captives, and intervened on behalf of the poor. These acts were highly visible and widely reported. They created goodwill beyond the court, anchoring the monarchy to the everyday lives of subjects. When unrest threatened, a beloved queen could calm it more effectively than soldiers. Some queens used this authority decisively. Matilda of Scotland cultivated a reputation for learning and generosity that stabilized her husband's rule and softened opposition. Her moral standing gave her political weight without formal command. Importantly, patronage outlived queens themselves. Foundations continued to pray for them. Endowments carried their names forward. Memory became infrastructure. Even queens who lost political battles often won the long game of remembrance through institutions that survived them. In medieval queenship, power did not always mean issuing orders. Sometimes it meant shaping the moral landscape in which orders were obeyed. Patronage allowed queens to root their authority in faith, culture, and care. Forces that endured when armies failed and alliances shifted. Medieval queenship was never tested more severely than during crisis. War, invasion, rebellion, or the collapse of royal authority forced queens into roles far beyond ceremony. In these moments, tradition bent or broke, and queens were judged not by etiquette, but by results. Survival itself became a political act. When kings marched to war or were captured, queens often became the most stable authority left behind. They organized defenses, raised funds, secured loyalty, and maintained order in fracturing realms. This was not theoretical leadership. It involved issuing commands, managing fortifications, and negotiating with hostile forces. The language of queenship shifted from intercession to command, even if chronicles tried to soften it afterward. War also exposed queens to extreme vulnerability. Captured queens were powerful hostages. Their treatment sent messages to allies and enemies alike. A queen imprisoned harshly signaled total victory. A queen treated honorably suggested restraint or negotiation. Either way, her body and status became tools of warfare. Some queens demonstrated remarkable resilience under these pressures. Blanche of Castile governed during open rebellion and foreign invasion, refusing to yield authority even when threatened directly. Her ability to project calm and control prevented fragmentation at moments when the crown could easily have collapsed. Others faced captivity. Queens taken prisoner had to navigate humiliation without surrendering legitimacy. Silence could be dignified. Defiance could be dangerous. Every gesture was calculated. Even in confinement, queens remained symbols. Their survival mattered because it preserved continuity. Killing a queen risked martyrdom and backlash. Crisis also sharpened public scrutiny. Decisions made during war were remembered far longer than years of stability. A queen who failed to act decisively could be blamed for defeat. One who acted forcefully could be accused of overstepping her role. There was no safe path, only necessary ones. What emerges from these moments is the reality that medieval queenship was elastic. It expanded under pressure. Queens who survived crises often emerged with enhanced authority, even if unofficial. Those who did not were rewritten as warnings rather than leaders. In war and captivity, queenship shed its gentler disguises. What remained was endurance, the ability to hold authority together when everything else failed. These moments reveal medieval queens not as passive figures swept along by events, but as anchors in political storms, expected to endure whether history rewarded them or not. For all the influence medieval queens could wield, their power was never secure. Queenship operated within strict boundaries, and crossing them invited backlash. The same visibility that enabled authority also magnified suspicion. A queen who acted too openly risked becoming a problem the political system felt compelled to solve. The limits were informal but absolute. Queens were expected to influence, not command. Advise, not rule. Persuade, not dominate. When they stayed within these lines, their power was tolerated. When they crossed them, even briefly, the reaction was swift. Chroniclers sharpened their pens. Nobles hardened their resistance. Mistakes that would be forgiven in kings became evidence of moral failure in queens. This backlash was not about competence. It was about discomfort. Medieval politics accepted female power only when it was framed as necessary, temporary, or maternal. A queen acting decisively during crisis might be praised. The same queen acting decisively during stability was accused of ambition. Context determined legitimacy more than outcomes. Visibility made this worse. Queens lived publicly. Their words were repeated. Their gestures were interpreted. Silence could be read as plotting. Speech as manipulation. Queens rarely had the luxury of neutrality. Once influential, they were watched constantly, and watchfulness bred resentment. This is why queens often relied on intermediaries. Advisors spoke for them. Councils executed their wishes. Orders were delivered indirectly. Plausible deniability was survival. When something succeeded, it could be attributed to consensus. When it failed, the queen could retreat behind custom. This was not weakness. It was adaptation. Some queens paid heavily when this balance collapsed. Isabella of France crossed from influence into overt political action, and was remembered less for stabilizing a failing realm than for violating expectations. Her effectiveness did not save her reputation. The narrative demanded punishment. Others learned to disappear at the right moment. Retreat could preserve legacy. Withdrawal was sometimes the most powerful move available. Queens who recognized when to step back often survived politically longer than those who pressed their advantage. The price of queenship was constant self-surveillance. Every act required calculation. Power was possible but never free. The system allowed queens to rule, but only if they accepted that legitimacy could evaporate overnight. Understanding these limits is essential to understanding medieval queenship. Queens were not powerless. They were constrained. And within those constraints, the most successful ones learned when to act, when to vanish, and when to let others believe the decision was never theirs at all. By the end of the Middle Ages, queenship was no longer an anomaly to be explained away. It was a functioning part of how monarchy operated. Queens were not temporary substitutes or decorative figures orbiting real power. They were embedded into the political system itself, expected to stabilize, mediate, and endure where kings often could not. What makes medieval queenship so enduring is that it relied on structure rather than permission. Ceremony legitimized queens. Lineage anchored them. Households empowered them. Custom protected them. Even backlash followed predictable patterns. Queens learned to operate inside this framework, bending it without breaking it. Their authority did not depend on radical change. It depended on mastery of existing rules. This is why queenship survived even as individual queens failed. When one queen fell from favor, another replaced her without dismantling the role itself. The system absorbed conflict. A queen could be disgraced, imprisoned, or sidelined. But the office of queenship remained intact, ready for the next woman to occupy it. That continuity is not accidental. It reflects how essential the role had become. Queens provided stability in a volatile political environment. They linked dynasties across borders. They softened transitions between reigns. They acted as guardians during minorities and anchors during crisis. Even queens who never ruled openly shaped outcomes through patronage, intercession, and influence. Their absence would have created gaps the system was not equipped to fill. Importantly, medieval queenship was not a single experience. It varied by kingdom, personality, and circumstance. Some queens ruled boldly. Others ruled quietly. Some thrived in regency. Others dominated through culture or diplomacy. What unified them was not style but function. Each queen was expected to serve the crown in ways kings could not or would not. This perspective challenges the idea that female power in the Middle Ages was accidental or exceptional. It was expected, regulated, and often relied upon. The system distrusted it, constrained it, and punished it when it strayed too far. But it also depended on it. Medieval queenship was not about breaking the rules. It was about understanding them completely. Queens who survived longest were those who recognized that power did not always announce itself. Sometimes it endured through ceremony, silence, and persistence. In that sense, queenship was one of the most resilient political roles of the medieval world. Not because it was free, but because it was necessary. So we traveled through time tonight. From the chaotic, public wedding nights of ancient Rome where privacy didn't exist and your entire neighborhood witnessed your marriage, to medieval England where a teenage French princess became a warrior queen defending her son's throne, through the bloodiest civil war England had ever seen, and finally into the complex world of medieval queenship where women wielded power through ceremony, diplomacy, and sheer endurance. What connects all these stories? The tension between what society expected and what people actually did. The Romans expected marriage to function like a business contract, so they made sure everyone witnessed it. Margaret of Anjou was expected to be an obedient foreign bride, so she became a military commander instead. Medieval queens were expected to stay silent and decorative, so they built empires of influence through patronage and intercession. History isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people navigating impossible systems, finding power in unexpected places, and surviving when the rules were designed to break them. The Roman wedding night teaches us that privacy is a modern invention. Margaret of Anjou teaches us that underestimating someone because of their gender or age is a dangerous mistake. The Wars of the Roses teach us what happens when a country forgets that stability matters more than ambition. And medieval queenship teaches us that power doesn't always look like power, that influence can be just as effective as command, and that survival sometimes requires more strength than victory. These weren't simple times with simple people. They were complex, messy, human times where people made choices with the options they had, not the options we wish they'd had. If you made it this far, thank you for taking this journey through history with me. If you enjoyed this exploration of the weird, the brutal, and the fascinating corners of the past, make sure you hit that subscribe button. There's so much more history to uncover, so many more stories that deserve to be told. Drop a comment and let me know which part surprised you the most. Was it the Roman relatives standing outside the bedroom door? Margaret leading armies? The sheer brutality of the Wars of the Roses? Or the subtle power games of medieval queens? History is never just about the past. It's about understanding how we got here, why certain patterns keep repeating, and what we can learn from people who faced impossible choices centuries before we were born. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember that the past is never as simple as we want it to be. And that's exactly what makes it worth studying.